Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher. This week I'd like to look at the whole question of how we assess coding and robotics. So I teach coding and robotics in grade 8 and 9, so that's kind of middle school area. And I've always struggled with what to do to assess that during exams. So my school admins usually insist that there be some kind of summative assessment during exam period, that coding and robotics is something seen as important. If it's not being examined, then it's not going to be seen as important by students. So I kind of buy into that logic. I would much prefer there to be no exam and that students be judged on the work that they do in class. But nevertheless, that's the system, and I can see the value in having an examination in coding and robotics at grade 8 and 9 level. But how do we assess coding, for example? Traditionally, and I'm talking about summative assessment here, traditionally I think it's been the product which has been assessed. Students are given a task, they have to code something. If the code isn't working, they have to comment it out so that the rest of the code works, and they submit that and are assessed on that. They are given marks for whatever they've done right. And I think this approach is important. It's important that students be able to create accurate code, be able to code it within a certain time period, and I think there is value in that kind of assessment during an exam. But I'm not sure that's true at grade 8 and 9 level. Coding exams I've always found very, very stressful for students because they have a particular time period in which they have to produce the code. And as we all know, if you've done any coding at all, you can go down rabbit holes, you can go down a wrong approach, things can go horribly south. You can spend hours trying to debug some silly little spelling error that you just can't spot. And this is a very stressful process for students, to be assessed on what you can perform in a 1 hour period, for example, on a Monday morning when you're not at your best. I don't think is a very fair assessment of one's ability to code. I would much rather be assessed on a much lengthier project where you've got time to explore different solutions, different approaches to solving problems, and you've got time to fix any mistakes in your code. Debugging can take an awfully long time, and that's not really factored into traditional summative assessment of coding. So I've been searching around for different options for a long time now. There have been times when I've had no exam in coding and robotics, and then felt that, that's affecting subject choice because students don't see it as important and therefore they're not taking it from grade 10 through to matriculation. So we then brought the exam back, and then what exactly do you assess? Coding is very much about solving problems. Robotics is very much about solving engineering problems. And how do you assess that in a given time slot on a given day of the examination? So I tried mini assessments. So these were little mini tasks where students had to, they were given, largely the task was given ahead of time. So you knew what you were going to have to go in and do on the day, and then you just pitched up on the day and did it. And that kind of worked because you had the task before, so you could think about your solution. You could revise any particular coding that you would need on the day. And to be honest with you, it was all a bit pedestrian. The good students would always do well because they would prepare ahead of time. There were students who did very badly because they didn't prepare. Even though they had the exam question ahead of time, they just didn't prepare for it. So I've been kind of searching around for something else, and I think I found the right formula now, and I'd like to share that with you today. So what I did differently this time around was to do the exam task in class time ahead of the exam. So I gave the students 4 lessons to work on a particular problem. So it was a very similar problem to what they'd had before and had to solve in the exam. So instead of having a kind of prep time ahead of the exam where they could look at the question, think about what they were going to do, prepare what they needed to do in the exam, they had all of class time to do that. They could work through the problem, they could be more experimental, more kind of on the spot. Try this out, try that out. They could seek help. So obviously, in class time, you can't stop people from leaning over and chatting to the person next door and working through it. I didn't set kind of exam conditions for working on the exam task. They were allowed all the kind of normal support that people have, all that kind of lovely Vygotsky stuff that we learn socially with other people. And if I was called over, the rule I had was that I would give a hint. I wouldn't give them a solution. So I would say, well, maybe it's because of this, your code's not working because of this, have you thought about that? So the second thing that I think doing it this way allowed me to do was to make it a much more open-ended task. So the task that I set for my grade 9s, for example, was to identify a problem within the school, something that isn't working within the school environment, and then to design a digital solution to that problem. So if the problem was litter, or the problem was drinking water quality, or lack of sanitation, or whatever it is, students identified numerous problems, some that I hadn't thought of as problems, others, they seemed to ignore what seemed to me to be obvious problems. And having identified a problem, they then designed a digital solution. So they had to hand in their design. So the design had to identify the problem and lay out, explain what their solution was. So that was the first submission. And this had to be handed in before the exam. So all of this had to be done in class. Many students did a sketch. So for example, if they were using a microbit chip, by the way, they could use any digital platform or any digital solution that they wanted. So if they wanted to create a website, or if they wanted to create a presentation, or if they wanted to make a movie, or if they wanted to code a game, or if they wanted to code their microbit chips, that all of that was fine. They could choose any digital solution, any platform, any program, and submit that. So most of the students chose the platforms that we'd been working on in class. So they chose platforms they were familiar with. We hadn't done MIT App Inventor yet, but I introduced students to that. So I said, here's this thing, if you want to create a mobile app, then you could use this. So there was one option where it was a platform that they had never used before. All the other platforms that I suggested were platforms that they had used before. So when they produced a sketch, for example, they might sketch the microbit, and here it has a sensor, and here it has a servo motor, and then it's going to automatically dispense. Some students had, for example, dispensing tampons when you waved your hand in front of it. So it detects motion and it opens the servo motor, which dispenses the tampon. So that was one example of a solution. And they were assessed for that particular task on how much detail they went through. How had they planned it out? Had they planned the solution through, or was it just a kind of pie in the sky? I'm going to create a website which will somehow solve the problem. The next thing that they needed to hand in was their digital solution itself. So they had to produce a digital solution prototype. So, for example, if they were producing a mobile app, they had 4 hours to work on this project in class. They didn't have to produce a whole app. They could produce just part of the app. A website, similarly. They didn't have to produce all the pages in a website, but it had to be a significant chunk of work to show how the solution would work. And that had to be handed in, again, ahead of the exam time. This gave me a chance to look at their solutions and so that during the presentation I had quite an idea of what they were talking about. So I think this is kind of fairly standard. They're being assessed on the product, how well does it work. They're not being assessed, however, on completeness. So some students did produce complete solutions. So I had one student, for example, who the problem they identified was how to identify problems in a school. So things go unreported. There's a leak in the girls' bathroom, and that's not being adequately reported. So they designed a whole system using Google Forms for reporting problems. So it was presented as a kind of whistleblowing app where you could click on a link and report a problem, and it would be reported as on a Google form, and then the authorities could take action and so on. And the rest of the website carried news, updates about when things were going to be fixed and that kind of thing. So a fairly detailed solution, and they produced a few examples of forms. So it was in fact a kind of working model for that. Another student used a spreadsheet for reporting lost property, and they had the spreadsheet organized with filters and categories and different tabs and things for different types of lost property, and this would be shared via Google Sheets, for example, so that students could view their lost property. Other students produced arcade games, so using the MakeCode arcade platform. So if the idea is that how do you incentivize the teaching of mathematics, they created a mathematics game using the arcade platform. Other students used the MIT app platform and produced apps. I think all of the students pretty much used tutorials to produce their products. So there are numerous tutorials on MIT App Inventor, for example, and they would then tweak that, or on arcade game platform, for example. Some students produced, how shall I call it? I think work that showed obvious outside influence. So either someone in the family who had a coding background, or they were using ChatGPT or something like that to produce the code. So they handed in these complex looking websites with all sorts of code that they had not learnt in class. And my approach to this was simply to ask them, well, did you do this work? If you did, it's absolutely fine. Just tell me how you put it together. And the vast majority of cases, all but one, in fact, simply submitted work which was a lot simpler and more in line with what they'd been doing in class. So I suspect that they had used ChatGPT and they'd been called out, or they had used a relative and had been called out. And they simply handed in something a lot more simple and a lot more in line with what they'd produced like a week before. One student said that she had a Python tutor, and that the Python tutor had helped her with the code, and I accepted that explanation. So that part of the assignment was assessed in a fairly traditional way by looking at the product. The next bit, however, was during the exam itself. The students had to present, and the vast majority of the marks for the exam project were carried by this. So you had to submit your design and your digital solution, your digital prototype ahead of time, ahead of the exam, and then during the exam you gave a presentation to the rest of the class on what you had done, and the major part of the marks for this were reflecting on the process. So this was an opportunity for students to explain their thinking and the design process behind what they had done. They weren't being assessed on the solution itself. That part of the assessment had already happened. What they were being assessed on majorly was their assessment or their reflection on what they had done, what they had learnt, problems that they had, and things like that. So it's this aspect of the project that was new to what I was doing, and I'd like to kind of break down what I learnt from this process. So here's an example from the slide presentation given by a high achieving student. The problem she identified was the need for translation in the school when you have exchange students who can't speak English. She wanted to design an app which would handle that translation, but she came a cropper on that one. She couldn't put it together. She spoke to a relative in the IT industry. He suggested that she look at APIs, but she couldn't get her head around that. But she found a tutorial on MIT App Inventor which used text to speech, and so she used that tutorial to put together a kind of simple demonstration of how you could get translation of particular phrases, and she used English to Spanish. So, I mean, what you can learn from that kind of reflection is the process that the student went through. And that's not something that you can get from a more traditional product-based assessment. And I think it's kind of very valuable in a kind of formative sense for the teacher to understand the problems students are going through when they try to solve a problem. And then they're looking for different digital solutions to solve that problem. So what I loved about this reflection in particular was that she had looked at different solutions. She hadn't gone to MIT App Inventor straight away. Her original idea was to code in Python, and then, she didn't have the skills for that. And obviously her relatives in the IT industry weren't prepared to kind of do the work for her. But she ended up going onto a platform and using tutorials to find out how to do something, and that is a kind of classic way of finding a solution, and really I think enlightening for me about the process that she went through. So how to assess that reflection? Well, first of all, her reflection is good quality reflection. She's described the process of design that she went through. She's described the struggle she went through. She's described the solutions that she found. And she knew the limitations of what she had found, that it would need a lot more work to get a fully functioning app to do translation. But I don't think, at a grade 9 level, one would expect a student to produce a fully functioning translation app. That just wouldn't be amongst the expectations, certainly, of the teacher. So the reflection really helped describe her process and describe the thinking that she had gone through. There were other students, and I have to be honest about this, that in their presentation showed almost no ability to reflect on what they had done. They had largely chosen unambitious projects, and here's the code, this is what I did, that's it, thank you very much, and sat down. And obviously the assessment of that, I think, reflects the quality of the thinking that they're putting into solving the problem. When I'm marking a digital product, it's very difficult to say, okay, what is the difficulty tariff here? You're presenting a mobile app that's supposed to translate versus someone who's got a microbit chip that when you press the A button, it plays happy birthday. The two are vastly different in levels of complexity. The one, the code is very accurate. The other, the code is largely accurate. How do you build that kind of difficulty rating in? And I think reflection is a good tool for doing that, because you can say, okay, your code works. You solved it, fine, I can give you the marks for that. But the majority of the marks are actually on your reflection and the quality of reflection and the process that you went through, which largely is determined by your ability to reflect and think about everything that needed to be thought about in order to solve the problem. And if your problem is very simple, then your reflection is going to be very short and very cursory, and you're not going to be assessed very heavily on that. That was my kind of initial reaction while marking the presentations in class. Subsequently, I had a few further thoughts about it and why reflection is so important. So I went away and did some reflection on the assessment process on the presentations that day. And the first thing that kind of occurred to me is that, yes, the length of your reflection, the presence of your reflection in your presentation, by and large tracked with the complexity of the project undertaken. So those people who tend to put a lot of thought in tended to bite off much larger projects. Also, people who chose very derivative assignments. So, for example, there was a lot of problem with the tuck-shop queues, and the standard solution that a lot of students chose was to create a website where you could pre-order. And a lot of students went on to Wix, and they used the templates on Wix to create a website. And okay, that's quite okay with me. You're using a digital platform to find a solution. But generally, those students in their reflection showed very little description of the process they went through in choosing the templates and so forth, compared to those students who, for example, were using a tutorial on MIT App Inventor or the arcade game platform or whatever it is, and were able to describe, I was using that tutorial, but the tutorial didn't quite do what I wanted it to do, so I had to tweak the tutorial. And that, to my mind, shows real learning. And the reflection was present in those presentations, and it was absent in the much more derivative work. I went on to Wix and I created a website where you could pre-order. That's pretty much end of story, and that tells a story in itself. So just the amount of just identifying that there was reflection in the presentation, I think largely tracked with the complexity and the thought that had gone into the project itself. And so I was quite happy that assessment reflected the reality on the ground, so to speak. But I think there's another aspect which occurred to me while thinking about the assessments. And that is that the quality of the reflection also describes the complexity or the quality of the thinking behind the task itself. So students who were able to unpack what they were thinking while designing something. So here was the problem, and how would a solution actually work with the problem? Would it solve the problem? Is it just a partial solution? Is it a complete solution? Reflections like that really got to the nitty-gritty of the design process and how their digital solution was supposed to solve the problem. So I was quite happy in that regard as well, not just the presence of reflection, but also the quality of that reflection, the depth of that reflection was also important, I think, in unpacking the tasks. So the kind of student who their solution was to press button A on the microbit and it sang happy birthday as a kind of motivational, fun element to throwing litter in a dustbin, compared to a student, for example, who if you pressed button A on the microbit, it would send a signal to the server which would lift the dustbin lid to improve sanitation or something like that. The more complex the solution that they were finding, and the more coding and the more thought went into the digital solution, was reflected in the quality of their reflection itself. So in describing the process they went through, their ability to describe that process largely tracked with the complexity of the task that they had shown. So projects that were very, very simple and very, very easy, where obviously not that much time had been spent on developing them, tended to also be accompanied by presentations in which the student didn't reflect much at all, gave no quality reflection on what they had done. Basically, there was nothing to describe. So, I don't want to knock, for example, using a template website design platform like Wix, but after all, you're dragging and dropping, and you could see in the products themselves that they had used stock photos, that they had changed very little from the template. Often, when you clicked on other things, you would just open up the template itself. And they had done very, very little. And so there was very little to reflect on and not much quality in their reflection. So very often the best part of what they were able to do was to describe the problem and suggest the solution. So that's absolutely fine, but it is limited. And so in developing rubrics for assessing reflection, I think it's quite important that part of the rubric should be the quantity of reflection. So that's one measure. The other measure is the quality of the reflection. How much detail have they got able to reflect on? Or is it just, I solved the problem by using a website where you can pre-order? That's not a lot of reflection. If they've done a lot of research and are able to talk about the research they've done, why it's important to solve that problem, then they put a lot more work in, and the quality of their reflection improves. So the main factors that tended to make for good reflections were research on the problem. Is it a problem? So one student even did a survey to find out what students thought were the biggest problem in school. I thought that was, that was very well done there. Other students were able to describe the problem in detail. Some students were able to describe their solution in detail or reflect on the difficulties that they'd had. And all of those, the depth of that reflection was important. So not only the breadth of the reflection, the amount of reflection they were able to do, but also the depth of that reflection, how much detail they were able to inject, I think was very, very important. So the rubric, I think, for reflection has to include that. I did include also some marks for the presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. A lot of students did it on Canva, which is absolutely great. Some students messed up and didn't give permissions. So when they tried to go into their assignments, into their presentations, they found a great deal of difficulty. And that's all part of kind of digital literacy. The ability to make a presentation and speak about your presentation to people, I think is an important skill worth examining in itself. So you were able to put together a certain amount of work in class, and that is assessed separately. But are you able to talk about your work, reflect on your work, and present your work to other people? I think a vital IT skill even in itself. So my purpose in making this video was, first of all, because I was very excited on kind of hitting on this formula of using reflection as the exam itself. I think it's far less stressful for students. I know making presentations is always stressful, but you've largely done the work. So you're putting together a PowerPoint with your screenshots and things like that is far less stressful than having to go into an exam and do the coding and things within a limited time. So I think it reduced stress for students, and I think it opened up new possibilities for assessing the process and the thought processes behind. And I was really, really excited to share this with you. So please, if you have any thoughts on this, if you've tried anything similar, or if you're going to try, please leave comments below so that we can start a conversation about this. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and above all, comment so that we can talk about and share our ideas around this. Bye for now, and see you next week.